Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second talk in this year's Bruce J. Nelson Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm Dagan Karp, Associate Dean for Diversity and Associate Professor of Mathematics at Harvey Mudd College. This year, the Nelson Series is now Social Justice and STEM, and we're excited to explore contemporary issues of social justice and consider how we might incorporate social justice work both in our daily practice and in our long-range goals. Tonight, we're pleased to continue this conversation with Professor Deepa Kumar, author and Associate Professor of Media Studies at Rutgers University. Before Professor Kumar is further introduced, I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of the family of the late Bruce J. Nelson, class of 1974, for establishing this educational series to honor Bruce's memory. Bruce died unexpectedly in 1999, though not before having a tremendous impact on the many people whose lives he touched as an unconventional, eclectic, and irrepressible free spirit. He graduated from Mudd as an independent program of studies major and later earned his master's in computer science from Stanford and his PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon. At the time of his death, he was the chief science officer at Cisco Systems. We're honored and grateful to the Nelson family for this opportunity we have each fall to host exceptional speakers who are at the forefront of their respective fields. I also want to offer thanks to the Nelson Series committee members for planning this year's series and for bringing tonight's speakers to campus. This includes my colleagues Sharon Garbodi, Colleen Lewis, Sumi Pendakur, Beth Truszowski, as well as students Ramonda Giddings and Lisa Geller. It's now my pleasure to welcome Sumi Pendakur to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. We are thrilled to have you here tonight, and I'm extra excited to introduce Deepa to you. But before we get into that, just the thought that speaking truth to power comes at a cost. Our speaker tonight has received her share of hate mail, targeting her views and her personhood. But Deepa's work, which helps us all to better understand the tangled web of imperialism, media complicity, foreign policy, and domestic impact, is a clarion call to listen and take action. As I mentioned last week in introducing Melina Abdullah, our first Nelson Series speaker, I said our HMC mission exhorts us to understand the impact of our work on society, but this year's Nelson Series ensures that we're deeply cognizant of society's impact on our work. So on behalf of the Nelson Lecture Series Committee, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Deepa Kumar. As Dagan mentioned, Deepa is an associate professor of media studies at Rutgers University. She's an affiliated faculty with Middle Eastern Studies and graduate faculty in the sociology department. Come on down, come on down. Her work is driven by an active engagement with the key issues that characterize our era: neoliberalism and imperialism. Her first book, Outside the Box, Corporate Media, Globalization, and the UPS Strike, was about the power of collective struggle in effectively challenging the priorities of neoliberalism. Now, if neoliberal globalization characterizes the economic logic of our age, the war on terror has come to define its political logic. Deepa began her research into the politics of empire shortly after the tumultuous events of 9/11. Her second book, titled Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, looks at how the Muslim enemy, in quotes, has historically been mobilized to suit the goals of empire. Just so you know, both of those books are available directly at the top of the lobby for sale and for signing at the end of the program. If you'd like to talk to Deepa directly or purchase the book, it makes a great Hanukkah Kwanzaa Christmas gift. She's currently working on a third book on the cultural politics of the war on terror, including an analysis of imperialist feminism as a justification for waging war. She's been active in various social movements for peace and justice and has written numerous articles in both scholarly journals and alternative media. And a note for our Mudders, Deepa's undergraduate majors were math and physics. That's so cool. So please join me in giving a tremendously warm welcome to Dr. Deepa Kumar.
Thank you, Sumi, for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me here at Harvey Mudd. I've had a great day meeting a whole bunch of students and faculty, and you all have been just exceptional in terms of the kind of culture and the atmosphere that you have at Harvey Mudd. Really a model for me to take back to Rutgers and try to emulate. But the hospitality and the generosity has been wonderful, but I have one complaint. I just got fed this fantastic dinner, and if I fall asleep halfway through my talk, it's not my fault. It's because of the excellent food that we all got to enjoy. So with that, I'm going to get started, unfortunately, on a topic that is quite serious and quite grave in the times that we live in today. And I want to begin by explaining the title, In Search of Monsters to Destroy. You may have heard of this. It's from a speech by John Quincy Adams in 1821. People know who John Quincy Adams is, I hope? Okay, good. And here's how he puts it. He says he's talking about the United States, of course, a newly formed nation at that time, right? Barely a few decades old. And he says, she has, that is the US, has, in the lapse of nearly half a century, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations while asserting and maintaining her own. She has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings, as to the last vital drop that visits her heart. Whenever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. So this is an image of American exceptionalism, of the United States as being this beacon of democracy and very different from every other nation and so forth. In reality, of course, this is not true. In the decades before Quincy Adams made this speech, the US had intervened in all sorts of places. In fact, even conservative historians will acknowledge that this is not a fact. This is how Max Boot, the conservative historian, puts it. He said, quote, the US has been involved in other countries' internal affairs since at least 1805, when during the Tripolitan War, William Eaton tried to topple the Pasha of Tripoli, end quote. There's also a book by the journalist Stephen Kinzer called Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq from 1893 to 2003. And in fact, in the few decades before Quincy Adams made this speech, the US participated in the war against the Seminole Indians, trying to capture Florida. In 1812, it invaded Canada in order to colonize it. Of course, that didn't succeed. And the entire 19th century was animated by this idea of manifest destiny, which is based on the notion that Anglo-Saxons are the special people and that they have this mission to actually conquer the entire country from coast to coast and establish a new exceptional state. And of course, this leads to the war with Mexico, the annexation of various territories from Mexico, and so on, all basic history, which I hope you've been taught. But at any rate, I bring up this brief history because in each of these cases, there was always a monster to be destroyed, right? And that's what justified conquest. So here's how Andrew Jackson, another US president, here's how he would put it in terms of justifying the intervention into Florida. He said, quote, the Seminole Indians inhabiting the territories of Spain have for more than 2 years past visited our frontier settlements with all the horrors of savage massacre. Helpless women and children have been butchered and the cradles stained with the blood of innocents, right? So women and children from the very founding of this nation has been a justification to go off and kill a whole bunch of people and take over their lands. And in fact, when he becomes president, Andrew Jackson, he would actually give a speech shortly after the Indian Removal Act, putting it this way. He would say, those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements. And then he would go on to say, because a superior race cannot exist next to an inferior one, and therefore they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstance and ere long disappear. Right? So the idea of the US as a melting pot and so on, again, we have to question that. But suffice it to say that out of this comes a policy of ethnic cleansing, if not genocide. Why do I bring all this up? Because right from the beginning, there has been a process by which monsters are created as a way to destroy them, as a way to justify expansion and empire. And of course, this is not something that happened all of a sudden. Indians weren't suddenly turned into savages. There's a history. Britain, when it takes over Irish land, would dehumanize the Irish people, would turn them into a race, right? Would racialize the Irish people, and thereby justify conquest of their land and exploitation of their labor. And so the wild Irish now becomes the savage Indian right here in the United States. And I'm going to show you an image. This is from Harper's Weekly. Not Harper's, not to be confused with Harper's. We know who is on the right. Yes, it's a racialized group that were turned into chattel slaves in order to fuel the plantation system. Can anyone tell me who the individual is who's sitting on the left scale? Obviously subhuman, right? Any guesses? The Irish. That's exactly right. The idea of the Irish as apes, as less than human, and so forth. So processes of racialization, right, where groups of people are turned into a race and then turned into a race of savages and monsters, has a long history. In other words, today, the turning of Muslims into a race, into a dangerous race to be feared, really comes out of this longer history. It is not something new. It, in fact, has a long history, and it has been used, and this history really is tied to a history of empire and conquest. And there's a brilliant new book by the political scientist Robert Vitalis called White World Order, Black Power Politics, in which he says, essentially, that the logic of white supremacy as a system has dominated the field of international relations, right? From its birth at the turn of the 20th century to the present, it has been based, as he said, quote, more or less on permanent tutelage for darker and inferior people by the superior people, right? And so the way in which African Americans were viewed in the United States, the denial of voting rights, for instance, to African Americans, very much impacted how people in the Philippines were going to be looked at. And if racialized others were denied voting rights here, then the ability of people of Filipino origin actually being able to rule their own countries were also denied. So the internal and the external have always been connected. And so today, that brings us to the question of Muslims and how it is that Muslims have been turned, particularly Muslim men, into these terrorist monsters that we should fear. Now, first of all, a little bit of context for this. The war on terror has been raging on now for about 14 years. It hasn't been terribly 15 years? 15 years. It has not been terribly successful, I would add. And trillions of dollars have been spent on this war on terror. In fact, just the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have cost anywhere between $4 trillion, this is a Brown University study, or $6 trillion, and this is Harvard University, so somewhere between those two. This is not to mention the drone program, military bases, the domestic homeland security industry. So you add all that up, and we're talking about trillions of dollars that has been invested in keeping us safe, supposedly keeping us safe in this country. And most Americans actually believe that terrorism is the key threat, one of the biggest threats that they face to their safety. So here is a Gallup poll trend. You'll see it starts in 2014, and then it goes all the way up to 2016. The question that people were asked is, how big of a problem do you think terrorism is? And you see the numbers. Majorities think it is either critically important or just important, right? So there's a lot of financial and emotional resources into fearing this terrorist threat, right? Majorities in this country actually fear that they're going to become a victim of a terrorist attack. Now, close your eyes and think for a second what this threat actually looks like. You don't have to close your eyes if you already know the answer. But what is this image of the terrorist threat? This, right? For most of us, it is Osama bin Laden. Or, more recently, ISIS, particularly this character. His name is Mohammed Mwazi, and he was responsible for those horrific killings of journalists and those videos that we saw some years ago. In fact, when I Googled the term terrorist and looked for all the images, I just said terrorist, I looked for all the images that came up, overwhelmingly they were either of fully masked men or of brown men with beards, right? And the presumption, of course, is that Muslims are somehow driven by the teaching of Islam to commit violence. What I didn't find was this. I don't know if you know who this person is. This is Robert Deere, who was responsible for the Planned Parenthood shooting last year. We know that he is an evangelical Christian. He is driven by a certain interpretation of Christianity. He views as heroes people in this group called Army of God, which is an anti-abortion group that's responsible for numerous bombings and murders. But he was not considered a terrorist. In fact, when this happened, the word terrorism was not even used. And far right-wing groups that are responsible, in fact, for more violence and more killing than jihadist groups are rarely considered to be terrorists. Now, I'm not saying that ISIS does not exist or that there aren't Islamic fundamentalists who do awful things. That is, of course, absolutely true. But when we think of ISIS, we think that they pose a threat to us when, in fact, they pose a threat to people in the region. The people that they are killing in large numbers are other Muslims, and they are fantastically unpopular in the region among Muslims. So the thing I want to make clear is that ISIS to Muslims is like KKK to people in this country, right? People know the Ku Klux Klan, right? Or Army of God, which is this Christian fundamentalist group. So the question then is, if in fact these groups do not pose such a big threat to us, what is it that most Americans die from? What are some of the key threats that they actually face? So I took this from the Center for Disease Control. And you see the biggest killer is heart disease, followed by cancer. You can go down the list, accidents. And down the list, it really bothered me to find that 41,149 people killed themselves, right? It says something about the society we live in, that many people are killing themselves, and we pay no attention to it. We don't even know this figure, most of us, right? So what about terrorism? How many people were killed in terrorist-related acts since 9/11? We know on 9/11 about 3,000 people died. Since then, how many people have been the victims of terrorist attacks, particularly by Islamic fundamentalists? Does that surprise you? In the 14 years since 9/11, okay? This is the number that have been killed. More people die every year in their bathtubs. You have a much higher chance of being struck by lightning and killing you rather than a terrorist attack. And so the question for us as a society is, why are trillions of dollars being spent on something that's really such a tiny and marginal threat? Now, for the skeptics among you, you may say, well, the reason the numbers are so small is because the domestic homeland industry, the anti-terrorism industry, what have you, are keeping us fantastically safe, right? Well, I thought of that. So here's some more facts for you. Trevor Aronson is an investigative journalist, and he studied 500 cases of terrorism prosecutions since 9/11, and he showed that a majority of these terrorism cases actually involved agents provocateurs. That is, people going into communities, inciting them to do something, and then catching them and saying, oh my God, yet another terrorism plot foiled, right? And in fact, there are 15,000 informants that are under the employ of the US government. A lot of them are criminals. And what they do, for instance, I'm very familiar with the Newburgh 4 case. These were 4 African-American men who desperately poor and sort of not, fully psychologically well-adjusted, mentally imbalanced in certain ways and so forth. And this guy, the agent provocateur, goes in, he gives them tons of money, he talks to them about what they can do because they're so alienated from society. And he says, well, if you go and you bomb this synagogue in the Bronx, you'll actually be achieving some justice through that process, etc. They go along with it. He provides them with the bomb, by the way. It's a fake bomb and so forth. And when one of them raises some objection and says, well, I really don't want to kill women and children, he chastises them and says, you've got to go through with it. Eventually, they all get into a van or a car, I can't remember what it was, and they're heading towards the Bronx. And lo and behold, they're arrested. And not coincidentally, the television cameras are right there to capture everything, and yet another terrorism plot foiled. Well, the truth of the matter, as Trevor Aronson shows, this wouldn't have happened if the agent provocateur didn't actually, make this happen. Now, The Intercept, which is a fabulous source of investigative journalism, finds that this is from documents that they obtained from the Department of Homeland Security. Between January 2014 and December 2015, there was all of one terror plot that was actually foiled, and this was in Garland, Texas, which I won't go into in any detail. But suffice it to say, we have to ask, trillions of dollars and one terror plot has actually been foiled? But the question is, every 2 months or so, the FBI announces yet another high-profile arrest of a terrorism suspect, and this is what keeps the U.S. war on terror at the multi-billion-dollar, level that it is. And of course, all of these institutions benefit from it. Of course, the media also benefit, right? What bleeds leads. And this gets covered all the time. And, call me a masochist. I actually watch CNN, and I watch the coverage of all of these things. And it's good for ratings. And it's good for the bottom line. And so we have terrorism theater that comes into being that ultimately keeps everybody quite scared. Now, the question for us is, and politicians. I can't not say anything about Trump, who wants to, deport everybody who doesn't look like him or think like him, of course. But his sharpest knives are towards Latino immigrants as well as Muslims and so on. And of course, everyone's scared of what he represents. But what I want to argue is that this attack on Muslims has actually been a bipartisan one. And the policies that have been put into practice, started by Bush, have been deepened by Obama. And I think it's important to recognize that this has been a bipartisan process. Now, the last thing that I have on this slide is the New York Times reported that there were 82 people in the US who were accused of trying to help ISIS. We don't know, these are accused. We don't know how many of them actually were involved. But the question really is, 15 years after the war on terror began, why are we seeing increases in attacks? Why are we even seeing 82 people trying to support ISIS? And I think that's a symbol of the failure of the war on terror, because what we are in is in this cycle of violence, right? Every time the US bombs Syria or does something, France passes a ban on the burkini or what have you, it fuels the agenda of groups like ISIS, because their whole philosophy, and this is what they published last February in their online magazine, The Beak, in which they argue that they attacked Charlie Hebdo because what they're doing, the Charlie Hebdo attack, right? I don't have to explain it. Okay. They attacked it because what they want to do is they want to destroy what they call a gray zone, which is most societies in which Muslims and non-Muslims actually live peacefully with one another. They want to polarize these societies so as to force Muslims to actually take up arms against people in the West and so forth. And so we're in the cycle where the violence of each side fuels one another. Of course, the disproportionate amount of violence comes from the US government comparatively. But at the same time, it creates an extremely unstable world where today I think we are more unsafe than we were 15 years ago. But the question, of course, is now all of us know who a terrorist is, but have we always felt this way? Has the United States always considered terrorism to be such a big factor? I'm going to argue no. In fact, prior to the mid-1970s, there was no such thing as a terrorist threat. And I was watching Back to the Future. I don't know if people have seen that film. It was a film I enjoyed growing up, and there's a scene in it where the Libyan terrorists come and, gun down, I'm giving away the suspense, sorry, but they gun down the dock, and it's just very tragic and all the rest of it. And Marty goes back in time, and he writes a warning letter to the dock, and he says, terrorists are going to gun you down. Of course, he's in 1955, when the term would have meant nothing, because there was no such thing as a terrorist. But the way that our media presents it is that this has always been the case, when in fact that is not true. It's not to say that things that today are called terrorism didn't happen. There were hijackings, there were kidnappings, as I say there. But the people who were responsible were not called terrorists. In fact, as Lisa Stampnitsky in a book called Disciplining Terror argues, these people were called all sorts of other things: bandits, rebels, guerrillas, urban guerrillas, revolutionary, insurgents, and so on and so forth. Another study by Remy Brulin finds that no American president prior to this period, the 70s, actually used the word terrorism to refer to hijackings or bombings or what have you. They would call them air pirates or sky pirates or hijackers, right? So what happens? Why does this change? So here we have, by the end of the 1970s, bombings, hijackings, kidnappings, hostage-takings were melded together to create a new and threatening actor, the terrorist. How and why? How does this process of the racialized threat, particularly the Arab terrorist and later the Muslim terrorist, how does that happen? I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but suffice it to say there are two very important events. One is the Munich Olympics of 1972, when a Palestinian group takes Israeli athletes hostage and later kills them. This was covered by the media worldwide, right? This gets massive attention. It also prompts a discussion in the UN about how to think about terrorism. There's a debate the year after in the UN about how to think about terrorism. And former colonial nations would say that states, that governments are not, do not create terrorism. Their violence should not be seen as terrorism, whereas those who are part of national liberation struggles are terrorists, right? So Nelson Mandela, people know who Nelson Mandela is. Embarrassingly enough, all the way up until 2008, I believe, was on the terrorist watch list, and he couldn't actually enter the United States. So it gives you a sense of how one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. At any rate, that is one pivotal moment. The other is the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And Israel, because of its very close relationship to the United States, would actually play a huge role, particularly through the Jonathan Institute, which was run by Benjamin Netanyahu, in shaping the language around terrorism, first as the Arab terrorist and then as the Muslim or Islamic terrorist. So the Iranian Revolution of 1979, this is how Time magazine interprets it. If anyone has ever been to Tehran, does it look anything like this? This is the image of some medieval, ancient civilization. You look at the buildings, etc. It's just, it's such a throwback. And the whole point of this is that the Iranian Revolution is not about workers, oil workers, fighting back. It's not about women going out on the streets. It's not about religious minorities. It's not about, all of the poets and artists and intellectuals all fighting back against the US-backed Shah. The Shah was this awfully repressive individual backed by the United States. By the way, he comes to power after a CIA coup, overthrows the democratically elected head of state, Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953. The Shah comes to power. He dissolves all political parties except his own. He has this he has a secret police, the Savak, that's trained by the CIA. All dissenters are rounded up, tortured, etc. Naturally, people are angry about that. So they go into struggle, into revolution, and all the rest of it. But time decides that that has nothing to do with it. It's all about these people wanting to go back to the Middle Ages. It's all about Islam and the revival of Islam. And here's another Time magazine cover. Some of you are old enough to know who the man who is sketched is. That is Ayatollah Khomeini. And even though I have very little sympathy for his politics, that is a ridiculous image of Khomeini, right? It had to be sketched because that's the only way you can get him to have jaundiced yellow color eyes. And he looks like Satan, right? Compared to, who's the guy in the little picture? Jimmy Carter, who, there's a God light. It's called a God light when there is a light above some, right? And so here you have it, good versus evil, the clash of civilizations, this demonic enemy. And the truth of the matter is that when you dehumanize the enemy, when you say that they are driven by rage, by fanaticism, not by politics, not by genuine grievances that the Iranians may have had with US policy in the region, not just in Iran, but around the region, supporting dictators that would then squash democratic movements, including in Saudi Arabia, where workers actually wanted to form unions, and the CIA helps the monarch to defeat those workers, deport the strike leaders, etc., etc. Politics has nothing to do with it. It's all about this cultural rage, right? They hate us for our freedoms. It's not about real-life issues or grievances. And the person who really pens this language is a man by the name of Bernard Lewis, professor at Princeton University, and Samuel Huntington was at Harvard, yes. And the roots of Muslim rage, he explains the roots of Muslim rage as having nothing to do with politics and conflict, but all driven by this cultural anger that has led to, he says, a 14th century clash of civilizations between the East and the West. And you look at this image of this bearded, turbaned man, right? And what's so interesting is that scholars who've studied these and other images and stereotypes of Arabs is that it actually draws from stereotypes of Jewish men, right? These were the caricatures used to demonize Jews in Europe. You tweak that image just a little bit and you've produced the Arab man, right? So that's how processes of racialization aren't distinct. One builds on the other, right? And it's not surprising because when you think about the history of the persecution of Jews in Europe, in 1492, it was not just the Reconquista kicking out, the Muslim rulers. Jews were also expelled from the region. So in fact, their two oppressions have gone hand in hand. But suffice it to say, we come to the 21st century. This argument that Bernard Lewis coins in 1991 is alive and well. And here you have it. Even their children have guns and they hate us, right? Muslim rage, not politics, is what explains the attitude of people in the Middle East. And so far, I've only given you examples from the news media. I want to turn now to the entertainment media to show how these ideas are both produced but also reflected in Hollywood. Get the lights.
The movies that we see basically follow Washington's policies. It's reflected in the cinema over and over again, particularly during the 1980s and the 90s, where you had perhaps 30 films which showed Palestinians as a people who were intent on injuring all Americans.
How may we help you, Jad?
One of the most despicable portrayals of Arabs and Palestinians occurs in the 1987 film Death Before Dishonor. First, they murder a guard and then slaughter an Israeli family. kidnap and torture an American Marine, and in cold blood execute another. And they burn the American flag right in front of the American embassy, and then dispatch a suicide bomber to blow it up. One reason we've not been allowed to empathize with any Palestinian on the silver screen is due to two Israeli producers, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. These two filmmakers created an American company called Canon, and they released, in a period of 20 years, at least 30 films which vilify all things Arab, particularly Palestinians. They even came out with a film called Hell Squad, showing Vegas showgirls trouncing Arabs in the middle of the desert. I think the most effective film they've ever done, one of the most popular and most racist, is The Delta Force. Here Palestinians hijack a plane and terrorize the passengers, especially the Jewish ones.
Pick out the passport with Jewish names.
There is no form of communication more powerful than film in creating propaganda, and Golan and Globus took it to another level. Certainly American producers play a role in vilifying Palestinians. I mean, perhaps the most anti-Palestinian film is True Law.
This apparently is the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
Crimson Jihad will rain fire on one major U.S. city each week until our demands are met.
This film is shown on television almost every week, over and over again. It is part of our visual heritage.
Give me the key! Come on, child! You don't want to die, do you? Give me the key, and you won't get hurt! I give you my word!
No way, you wacko!
And we never see Palestinians who suffer under occupation, Palestinians in refugee camps, Palestinians who are victimized, who are killed, innocent Palestinians. These images are denied us. Now, why are they denied us? Is there an unwritten code in Hollywood saying we cannot and will not humanize Palestinians? I mean, why can't we humanize Palestinians in the same manner in which we humanize Israelis? Is not the life of a Palestinian child, media-wise, Hollywood-wise, politically-wise, as important, as humane, as valuable as the life of an Israeli child? And if the answer to that is yes, why can't we see that on silver screens?
Right. So through the 1980s and 1990s, if you want to watch the rest of it, it's a documentary called Real Bad Arabs, and that's Professor Jack Shaheen. I just showed you that clip to give you a sense of the kind of cultural work that gets done in the 1980s and the 1990s, so that when the Oklahoma bombing occurs in 1995, it is immediately assumed that Arabs and Muslims are to blame. Of course, later on, we find out that it's Timothy McVeigh, right? Homegrown terrorist, if you will. But at any rate, by the time we come to 9/11, the association between Arabs, Muslims, and terrorism has been entrenched. And from that moment on, in fact, it is no longer necessary to keep reproducing the brown terrorist image again and again. One study by the Norman Lear Center found that of all the popular, I forget how many shows they analyzed on TV, they analyzed a bunch of popular television shows, they found that 67% of the terrorists were white, right? And why is that? Because largely multiculturalism, anti-racism, and even feminism has been appropriated by the national security state in its imagery, in its advertising, etc., in order to strengthen the war on terror and to actually say there's nothing racist about this, folks, because we're all involved in this process of vigilance, right? And the next thing I want to turn to is how, through getting us to practice what I call security rituals, which is not blatantly or obviously racist, particularly in the Obama post-racial era, it keeps the threat of terrorism alive. Take a look at this. This is where I hang out in New York City. This is where the campaign first started. If you see something, say something. It went national in 2010. There's nothing there, right? There isn't the image of the brown terrorist who's filled with rage, wearing a turban or what have you, because there's no need for that anymore. And in fact, that's the whole point, is to get you to be vigilant and to be scared of anything, to be suspicious of anything, right? And here's how it gets normalized. Watch this ad.
I pay attention for a living. I watch plays and make important calls. While I'm busy watching the game, I need your help keeping an eye on the stands. If you see something suspicious, make the right call. Tell a law enforcement official.
So there you have it. Just as a coach, I don't know who that is. Is that somebody famous? Okay, good. Just as a coach watches plays in a game, which is normal, it's the kind of thing he does, all of us should be busy watching for suspicious things around us. And I just finished a paper around this. Would it surprise you that even though this language is colorblind, even though they no longer have the brown terrorist and so on, the majority of calls that get made and texts that get sent are of brown and black people, African Americans, Arabs, South Asians, and so forth, because that language has been thoroughly learned. It's seeped into our unconscious, if you will. This campaign is on college campuses as well. And I think Edward Snowden is right when he says, quote, "A child born today will grow up with no conception of privacy at all. They will never know what it means to have a private moment to themselves, unrecorded and unanalyzed." And here we have an Asian woman. She sees something suspicious. She observes and she texts, right? This is the new security ritual. We observe and we text, very much like duck and cover. Do people remember duck and cover? Those of you, some of you are nodding, but they're mostly people with no hair or gray hair. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but many of you who are too old to remember the Cold War, I brought this so you can see what kind of education was given to kids. They had to duck underneath their desks and cover, but here is Bert, the adorable little turtle.
Dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association.
Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people. Please? Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time. Fire is a danger. It can burn whole buildings if someone is careless. But we are ready for fires. We have a fine fire department to put out the fire, and you have fire drills in your school so you know what to do.
Okay, we can say so much about that. One, the adorable little turtle. How can you not like him? The appeal that he has to the kids watching this. And further, the kind of mentality that these civil defense drills cultivated, right? It was not just in schools. It was everywhere. You heard a siren, and you had to immediately prepare by taking, evasive action, standing next to a door frame or ducking underneath and so on. And of course, you think about it, and you think about whether, if you are in the eye of a nuclear bomb going off, whether a desk is actually going to protect you, and unlikely, right? Or impossible, perhaps. And so the question is, what is the point of doing something like this? It is to cultivate a certain kind of threat consciousness, which when repeated often enough, that's why it's a security ritual, right? You keep doing it again and again and again, and you never think about it, but it makes an impact very deeply that you actually have a society that's dangerous, and therefore you need to behave in certain ways and give consent to the formation of this massive national security state that gets formed after the Second World War. People know the National Security Act would create all sorts of new institutions that didn't exist before, like the Joint Chief of Staffs, the National Security Council, the CIA, etc., etc. And essentially, in order to win consent for the growth of this massive national security state and to divert public funds to the development of this, such security rituals became central to the process. And of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, it became essential to try to find another threat, and now we have a different kind of security ritual. I'm sort of simplifying what is a much more complex argument. I have a paper coming out on it, but you get the general thrust of it, is how this functions is basically to keep people scared, not uncontrollably scared. You look at some of the research on emotion management, it is not in this crazy way where you'll go and do something ridiculous, but it's a very managed kind of fear that leads to obedience, right, as opposed to critical thinking, as opposed to dissent, and all the rest of it. So I'm going to come to a close with this. What is to be done? This is a short video by, and you're going to hear a woman who's a former CIA agent, and I checked her out. She seems to be legitimate. And she's making an argument that I find interesting, so I thought I'd show that to you, and then I'll make a few final comments.
I was an officer with the CIA clandestine service and worked undercover on counterterrorism and intelligence all around the world for almost 10 years. The conversation that's going on in the United States right now about ISIS and about the United States overseas is more oversimplified than ever. Ask most Americans whether ISIS poses an existential threat to this country, and they'll say yes. That's where the conversation stops. If you're walking down the street in Iraq or Syria and ask anybody why America dropped bombs, you get, they were waging war on Islam. And you walk in America and you ask, why were we attacked on 9/11? And you get, they hate us because we're free. Those are stories manufactured by a really small number of people on both sides who amass a great deal of power and wealth by convincing the rest of us to keep killing each other. I think the question we need to be asking as Americans examining our foreign policy is whether or not we're pouring kerosene on a candle. The only real way to disarm your enemy is to listen to them. If you hear them out, if you're brave enough to really listen to their story, you can see that more often than not, you might have made some of the same choices if you'd lived their life instead of yours. An Al-Qaeda fighter made a point once during a debriefing. He said all these movies that America makes, like Independence Day and Hunger Games and Star Wars, they're all about a small, scrappy band of rebels who will do anything in their power with the limited resources available to them to expel an outside, technologically advanced invader. And what you don't realize, he said, is that to us, to the rest of the world, you are the Empire, and we are Luke and Han. You are the aliens, and we are Will Smith. But the truth is, when you talk to the people who are really fighting on the ground, on both sides, and ask them why they're there, they answer with hopes for their children, specific policies that they think are cruel or unfair. And while it may be easier to dismiss your enemy as evil, hearing them out on policy concerns is actually an amazing thing, because as long as your enemy is a subhuman psychopath that's going to attack you no matter what you do, this never ends. But if your enemy is a policy, however complicated, that we can work with.
So that's what I'm going to leave you with, which is that if, in fact, we step back from the dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims, and if, in fact, we look concretely at politics and what motivates people to do what they do, and if, in fact, we look critically at how money is spent in the United States on these wars abroad, which make us more unsafe rather than safer, and if we look at the fact that today, your generation has $1.2 trillion in student debt, and you can take a fraction of what's spent on the war on terror, and it would wipe out student debt. We could maybe prevent at least a handful of those 41,000 people from committing suicide by offering them support, perhaps by offering them good jobs. Maybe we could actually invest in cancer treatment. Maybe we could have free health care for everybody in this country so many people don't die from preventable diseases. Those are the conversations we should be having. And I think it starts by having a critical attitude towards the war on terror and not giving in to the fear that is cultivated by politicians, that's amplified by the national security state, and that's captured by the mass media. So thank you. And
that was a great presentation. Thanks for being here with us. I especially liked the last video you showed us where the ex-CIA agent said that we should be listening to what the enemy, in this case ISIS, is saying before we engage with them. And I don't know whether you read this article in their magazine, Dabik, that you quoted from. It's titled, "Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You." And there are 6 reasons, and I'm reading from it. It goes, 1, because you are disbelievers. 2, because you are liberal. 3, because some of you are atheist. 4, for your crimes against Islam. 5, for your crimes against Muslims. And 6, for invading our lands. And at the end they say, what's important to understand here is although some might argue that your foreign policies are the extent of what drives our hatred, this particular reason for hating you is secondary, hence the reason we addressed it at the end of our list. So why do you think ISIS is couching this in the terms that it is, and to whom is it perpetuating this version of the war? Who is it trying? What are the people that would find this version of the war attractive?
Good question. Let's take a couple of questions, and people should feel free to answer each other. I've just been talking for 1 hour, so I want to hear from you, and then I'll come back.
Thank you for coming here. And you say, second question, you said that the idea of a terrorist is now a Arab or Muslim man. Is that just a byproduct of that's easier to sell, like men, like being like the abusers and victimizers in the media, or is that like a separate byproduct of like genderedness in Islam? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Your title, In Search of Monsters to Destroy, seems to imply that there's something deliberate and calculated about the search of monsters. So I was just curious if you would say something about what are the motivations behind this need to search for monsters in general.
Okay, one more and then I'll come back.
a little story for 1 minute. About 2 horrible hours I suffered after 9/11 in a city called Canterbury in England. I visited my scientific partner in England, in a city called Salisbury. He accommodated me in a guest house. So for 1 month, each Friday I used to go to London and return back. Not Friday, Sunday. However, one time before I left the railway station towards my guest house, I said, I miss the Cathedral of Canterbury. I want to have a walk around it. So I made a walk, and then I went to the guest house sleeping. After 1 hour, I found the woman who runs the guest house knocking on my door, saying, look, switch on the television. I switched the television on to find news of the local area saying that a suspicious bag was found around the cathedral, and a man relatively tall of Middle Eastern features was found walking around the cathedral. So I spent 2 hours, I don't know what to do, but after 2 hours they found that this suspicious bag was just abandoned meal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll take up each of these questions briefly. Obviously, one could say a lot about each of them. Now, I personally have not studied Dabiq in any detail. I would refer you to the work of Adam Haniyeh. He has some excellent analysis of ISIS's propaganda. I don't study it in any depth. But my guess would be that they are trying to recruit people both from the region, but primarily from the West, right? An investigative journalist who I know who writes for several magazines actually went to Iraq and interviewed people about what the attraction of ISIS is. And, well, a lot of the time what happens is that they kind of terrorize you into joining them, he writes. At other times, they bring some kind of stability in a war-torn region. And so people are like, fine, at least there is some stability, we'll go with these people, right? And these stories are so common. You look at, Seymour Hersh, the award-winning journalist, and he's the one who broke My Lai, right? The My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And we invited him actually to Rutgers to give a talk, and he had just come back from Afghanistan. And he was explaining, he said, look, I've been interviewing all the people who've joined the Taliban of late. And I asked them why. And so this one young boy, he said, of 15 or 16 years or something, he's speaking to him. He says, why did you join the Taliban? And the guy says, well, a bomb fell on a wedding party. My entire family was wiped out. Now I have nothing. All I have is anger, and I want to join the only organization that there is that will take on the US and the region. So you see how the conditions of war that NATO, that the US creates, actually is very fertile ground for ISIS did not exist until the US intervention into Iraq. Of course, various regional players would also play a key role in allowing ISIS to come into being. But it is these kinds of awful, catastrophic situations that actually allows these kinds of groups to come into being. And in terms of their specific propaganda, I mean, they're trying to reach out to people alienated in the West, particularly in Europe, where they have actually a lot more attention than they do in the United States. And, in a class that I was in earlier today, one of the students said, they were flying somewhere, and she was flying with 2 South Asians. And the South Asians said to her, yeah, you go ahead, you're going to fly right through, and they're going to stop us and ask us questions. She's like, no, this is not going to happen. This is completely random. You guys have done nothing, what have you. And sure enough, particularly the South Asian male gets pulled aside. He's asked for extra ID and so on. Now imagine what that's like, right? On a daily basis, you are seen as a threat. You are subject to what are called microaggressions. you are treated like an outsider, that's not a very nice place to live. And 1 in 10 or 20 million of people who are angered by how they're treated will take arms, right? So the guy who actually shot, 100-something people in Orlando, at first the story was that, ISIS had its hands all over it. Why? Because he makes a call and so forth. But later on, the FBI would say, well, we're actually not pursuing ISIS on this because there is no connection. If anything, Mateen was actually a gay man who, living as a Muslim, as somebody who didn't fit in one sense and didn't fit in another sense, extremely alienated from society, sort of takes his rage out in this sort of messianic way by killing people in a gay bar. So that's, the kind of society that fuels this sort of thing. And of course, ISIS wants to capitalize on that and say, join us, come to Syria, come to Iraq, what have you, and, we'll fight for justice or what have you. And of course, when people actually travel there, they realize what a nightmare it is, particularly women who've traveled from Europe to the region. It's just there's a lot of stuff on Twitter, which I won't go into, but most of them are dying to get out of there. All right, why male terrorists? Well, it's because, let's go back a little bit. Back in the 1970s, both men and women actually were the focus of terrorism. This was the era of the PLO, of secular nationalists, and so on. In fact, you think of a movie like Bloody Sunday, if people know that movie. The key antagonist in that movie is a woman, an Arab woman, who, her plan is to get this Goodyear blimp and to kill everybody at a stadium and so forth. So, in fact, women were part of this narrative in the early part of its history. But then when it turns from the Arab terrorist to the Islamic terrorist, actually, just numerically speaking, there are more men who have been involved in these sorts of things. But even if you look at the literature that the FBI and a whole number of other agencies have on radicalization, right? You've heard this term radicalization. And most of the literature that exists on that is either a 3-step process or a 5-step process. And the first step is growing a beard or starting to wear Islamic clothing or what have you. So it very much is focused on men, right, rather than women. And of course, if you've grown a beard, if you become more pious, and the second step, I believe, is something like if you're interested in community well-being and you're starting to do things in your community and all the rest of it, you're on a fast track to becoming a terrorist, right? That's when they come and visit you and they entrap you and, throw you behind bars and so forth. Finally, why the search for monsters? This history goes back to as long as human beings have existed, right? There's always been a process of othering. When human beings want to do something evil to other people, the only way we seem to be able to do that is by dehumanizing the other, right? By saying that somehow they are not like us. They are less than us. They are monsters. They are evil. They are savage, what have you. And then it justifies violence. It justifies conquest. It justifies genocide and what have you. So I think, even though racism is actually a modern phenomenon, it doesn't actually come into being until the birth of capitalism. You go all the way back to Greece or to Rome, the Roman Empire, right? The term barbarian actually comes out of Greek society. Anybody who wasn't Greek was a barbarian, and the Romans take that term on. And of course, the minute you come under Roman rule, you're part of the Roman Empire, and you adopt Roman cultural ways, you stop being a barbarian. You become a Roman, right? So to the extent that you get assimilated, you're not an enemy, but to the extent that you pose any kind of resistance or challenge, then you are a monster and you will be destroyed. So I think that's one way to think about this, is that dehumanization is central for humans who, I believe, I'm a humanist. I actually don't think that humans are fundamentally cruel, because in fact, for the bulk of human history, people lived in hunter-gatherer societies. These were largely I don't mean to romanticize it, but these were largely egalitarian societies. It's when we went to societies that were unequal, when there were wealth disparities, when there were class disparities, that some folks had to hold on to their power, and then comes conflict, then comes the oppression of women, and then comes the dehumanization of people to justify these processes of establishing power and control. Take a last round. Questions, comments, disagreements? You're welcome to disagree with me. Yeah.
I was curious why you focused on defining terrorism as having started so recently. When I was in elementary school in the 1950s, I distinctly remember propaganda being propagated in the forms of books by Dr. Tom Dooley. I was curious to know if you remembered any of this, because what he was doing was demonizing the South Asian insurgency leading up to what became the Vietnam War.
Interesting.
Popular books that were encouraged, the elementary school students were encouraged to read them, and it was basically about how these terrorists came into the, and he used the word terrorism maybe, but it was very distinctly terrorism in my memory. So maybe we're not using the word, but it was the same concept. Maybe in these villages and terrorize the population.
Okay, thank you. Others? Don't all speak at once. Yes. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Deepa. Would you care to comment on any parallels between the systemic drone strikes overseas and the targets of those strikes, and then domestically police violence against people of color, in terms of the projection of empire and the consequences of it at home?
Yeah. Great. One more, and then I'll just... Hi.
Hello. Okay. So you mentioned, I think, something about how feminism and those kind of movements are used to further spur war on terror and terrorism and all of these very oppressive narratives. I was wondering if you could speak more about that.
Absolutely. Wow, that's a whole talk on its own, so... Yes, and I'm doing that exactly. So let's see, we'll try to do justice in about 3 or 4 minutes, if possible, to all these questions. I don't know the Dooley book, so I don't know how to comment on it. But my argument is that in the United States, there isn't a developed language around terrorism, but it doesn't mean that there isn't developed language in Europe, right? In fact, it goes all the way back to the late 18th century and so on, where terrorist was used in certain sorts of ways, which I won't go into that history. But suffice it to say that in the post-World War II era, in the context of various decolonization struggles, there develops a very clear vocabulary that anybody challenging colonial rule is a terrorist, that they are using terror, and therefore the case of Vietnam and the National Liberation Front using terror to actually get their way, terrorizing civilian populations. So it's not as if it's unprecedented, but it moves across the Atlantic only in the 1970s, in the mid to late 1970s, and it's because of the U.S.'s close relationship to Israel, particularly after 1967, that some of the, and particularly the connections between the neoconservatives and the Likud party, they would start to develop this language and this vocabulary much more thoroughly in the United States, right? Because at the time we had the Cold War, and the key enemy and the key threat was the Soviet Union, which brings me to the question of McCarthyism. People know what McCarthyism is. Joseph McCarthy, right? Not Eugene McCarthy. Yeah, okay. Joseph McCarthy, sorry, it's late. This is like I'm in a different time zone. This is well past my bedtime. Joseph McCarthy would be this, senator who would come and, he came to and said I have a list of 242, was it? Communist sympathizers within the government, and we need to get rid of them, and so on. But really, McCarthyism was much bigger than McCarthy himself. It was really a system by which any opinion critical of U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy would be policed, and people would be drawn up in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. This included Hollywood people, right? If you haven't seen the movie Trumbo, watch it. Really, really fantastic film on the Hollywood witch trials. Professors who were leftist were hauled up. All of this was necessary because if you're going to reorganize society as dramatically as the US did after the Second World War and build this massive national security state, which would not just involve a reorganization of government, but would involve a reorganization of the entire society, including universities. My field actually comes out of psychological warfare research, right? My field gets a lot of money from the US government on how better to manipulate people around the world so that they fall in line with US policy. And what's interesting is that the psychological warfare research that's done to be used elsewhere gets used by the civil defense, duck and cover, and those folks to figure out how best to manipulate the American public. So it's in that sense that empire is not just something that happens there, it happens here too. We have to be prepared and reorganized to make sure that dissent is squashed in this society so that this agenda can carry on. Do we have the same level of witch hunts and all the rest of it today? No. But I think that's where people want to go. There are a whole number of private entities like Cannery Mission. I'm on their hit list, by the way, as are many distinguished professors of Middle East studies. I'm proud to be on that list. And there are graduate students as well on that list, which is very scary for them. I'm a tenured professor. There's nothing they can do to me. But, when you're a graduate student, you're much more vulnerable. So, yes, they are starting to emulate these McCarthyite ways. And these days we have all sorts of goons who will send you death threats and rape threats, and I get tons and tons of them. At one point it became bad enough that I actually had to report it to my campus police to see if any of them would actually carry through on it. And there was one case of this guy who apparently took a gun to his therapist's office and threatened to kill the therapist and then come and kill me. So I was informed about that. So what does all of that do? It intimidates people, right? It makes them scared. It says, don't do this kind of research. Don't speak out, because if you do, you'll have a big cross on your forehead, and God knows who's going to come after you. But I tell that story not to scare people, because when Fox News attacked me last year, it was incredible, the thousands of people who came out in support of me. Lawyers who said, hey, we'll work free. If you need us, let us know. Media, journalists who said, you want my team of international journalists to make a big, huge stink about this? Let me know. Activists. I will pay for 10 buses on my own and get them to come out. So it's really so gratifying that at the moments, if you've spent your life fighting for other people, when you're in trouble, people will have your back. So for me, that really was a moment of recognition that if you fight for justice, people will have your back and come out for you. Drone strikes, spying on people domestically, all the rest of that stuff. Well, there's a great book. I'm not going to answer your question directly. I'm going to plug a book here, Andy. And that is, it's called Incarcerating the Crisis. And it's basically about what's called the carceral state, right? People know that the United States imprisons more people than any other country on this planet. In the 1960s and 70s, that figure was about in the 200,000 range. By the 2000s, we've got 2.4 million people in jail, behind bars. More African Americans are imprisoned by our prison industrial complex in the US than blacks under apartheid in South Africa, right? So why did this happen? Well, in part because they wanted to put back the social movements that really shook the edifice of this country back into the bottle. And imprisoning African Americans, Latinos, dissenters, and so on was one way to do it. But always, when there are attacks abroad, the attacks at home, come in short order. And in fact, they learn from one another, right? So this great book about how the counterinsurgency practices that were developed in the Philippines, right? The U.S. occupies Philippines in the early 20th century. All the strategies that they use to track the leaders, who are they, where do they live, what do they think, etc. All those practices would come back home to be used right here, not only against racialized groups, but against Reds, against radicals who are actually organizing in the labor movement, immigrants, and all the rest of it. So these two have always been connected, and they still remain connected to this day. Finally, feminism. Nancy Fraser has a really good book called Fortunes of Feminism, in which she essentially argues that what happened in the 1960s and 70s is that the movements for social justice, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, and so on, got split off from the movements for economic justice, right? And since then, neoliberalism has actually co-opted these gains, anti-racism, anti-sexism, against homophobia and so on, into the system itself. That you read, the business press, they're like, it's fantastic if we can have women and people of color and disabled on our decision-making bodies, all the better to sell with, right? But never mind that even though you have a few people at the top of society running empire, like the Condoleezza Rices or the Colin Powells or the Hillary Clintons or what have you, the vast majority of people actually don't benefit from their system. So what's happened is that in this country, we've seen a massive decline in wages over the last 30-some years, which everybody suffers from, right? So the struggle for economic justice has been squashed, or put another way, class struggle, trade unionization has been squashed, and instead, this kind of struggle has been pitted against this kind of struggle, right? And that's a problem. We need to bring them together, because the working class in this country is not white and male. White males are actually the minority of the working class, as Eric Olin Wright and other sociologists have shown. The vast majority of people in the working class are white women and people of color. So the vast majority of people in this country, the 70% who are part of the working class, have every interest in fighting around economic justice, fighting against racism, fighting against sexism, and rejecting the kind of faux feminism represented by, I'm sorry, I'm saying this in the last minute, I don't give you a chance to respond, but represented by the likes of Hillary Clinton. Don't get me wrong, I think Trump is a horror show. If he gets elected, he will probably have me shot immediately. So I do not underestimate the kind of threat that he poses, but I'm scared too of what Clinton represents, right? From her being on the board of Walmart, a notoriously anti-union company before she joined and after she left, to the fact that Wall Street is willing to pay her over $200,000 to give speeches, and she refuses to release those speeches, to her role in the Obama administration in deepening the surveillance state, in increasing and escalating the drone attacks, to what have you. This is a person who's very much a part of the establishment, and I'm afraid of what a Clinton presidency would also represent. So my solution to this is not to vote for somebody pretending to be a feminist, because she's not. It is instead to build social movements from the bottom up. Obama actually once said, if he was a politician back in the 1980s, he would be considered a moderate Republican. That is true. And if he was in the 1970s, he would be considered a conservative Republican. Not because Nixon was this fantastic guy or what have you, but because the movements of the 1960s had shifted the political debate so far away from where it was in the stifling era of the 1940s and 50s that you couldn't get away with doing the kind of things that politicians today are doing. And the problem is that every time we vote for the lesser evil And this has been the choice for the last 60 years, the greater evil and the lesser evil. We legitimate the lesser evil. The lesser evil moves slightly more to the right, and the greater evil moves even more to the right. This is a vicious cycle, right? Who you want to vote for in November is entirely your choice. But if we don't build the movements that are necessary to bring about meaningful change, if we hide the real record of the Clinton administration and we don't criticize these people, then we are truly doomed, because I will predict that in 4, 8, 12 years, we will be being asked to vote for somebody like Trump because the Republican candidate is so much worse. And I think at some point we have to draw a line and we have to say, what kind of change do we want? What kind of society do we want to live in? And what are we willing to do to actually get that kind of society? Thank you.